One. Hi, this is Damien from AtHope, and I am an Axiological Atheist. And I'm here with a guest. Could you go ahead and tell us who you are and what kind of atheist you are?
Well, hello all. My name is Bill Zuersher, and I'm the author of a book. The name of the book is Seeing Through Christianity, A Critique of Beliefs and Evidence. I wrote this book because I was very concerned about the role that religion, and particularly Christianity, was playing in our public discourse, government, debates about public policy and economics. And I started to think about, well, rather than getting into individual debates about topics like having a national motto, "In God We Trust," or having prayer in schools, rather than getting to all those specific debates, why don't I go to the root of the problem? And I saw the root of the problem being dogma, and specifically Christian dogma. Yeah. And so that's why I wrote the book.
Well, I really appreciate you writing the book. I definitely think that I focus on all religion in general, and throughout time including. But I really think it is important, and I always feel like some people that say, well, you shouldn't focus on one religion. Well, if you're in America, then you can't avoid needing to focus on Christianity. So I do appreciate your book.
Yeah, no, Christianity is definitely the top dog in the U.S., and you see that in a lot of the civil discourse. There's a sort of a Christian privilege, like it's just assumed that this is normal and everything else is some sort of strange fringe belief. But we do see, as the polls come out and the younger generation is being a little bit more skeptical toward religion, we're seeing the rise of the nuns, those who say that they have no political, or rather no religious affiliation, and that's encouraging.
Oh, I agree. It is encouraging because it's good to move past, fables and fear, into facts, and into a more friendly, approach to science. Because I think it's so interesting how the people that want to fit this fantasy be real have this need to make reality unreal.
Yeah, it's like they can't stop talking. And so what I tried to do in my book is, Seeing Through Christianity, I tried to take it into two pieces. The first half of the book is all about the beliefs and the doctrines, and these are various stories, essentially, that ancient Middle Eastern men told in order to try to explain the world, and then they got a gloss with Persian influences and Greek influences. We'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
So the first half of my book is all about the doctrines, and then the second half of the book is all about the evidence, analyzing what the historical evidence is, and taking a look at the scriptures, the so-called scriptures, and seeing where the contradictions are, and sort of seeing the human footprints beneath the words.
I like how you say that, because I always say that the biggest thing that I realized when I started researching, the evolution of religion and I look at religion back from animism at 100,000 and at least, and totemism at least at 50,000, shamanism at least at 30,000, and then paganism at least at 12,000, and then what I call progressed organized religions at 5,000. And that's what, to me, when you, like Christianity and all these other religions, more directly fit to the 5,000, but actually there's elements that connect all the way to the 100,000. It's small elements, like the belief in the afterlife, the belief in spirits, the belief in somehow magical nature. It's just animistic thinking going back. But I would say that the one thing that's so obvious to me is, by looking at everything, is religion as a product. This is something that human fingerprints are all over, just like you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we see, it's interesting, you picked that sort of 5,000 to 10,000 year ago, that kind of time. That's an interesting cutoff, because that's what, historians would call when you had the agricultural revolution, right, or the Neolithic revolution,
right,
when people started settling down into cities and growing crops.
That's right.
And that's when you had economic surplus, and you could afford to have a priestly class of people who were living off the surplus. And that's when you had really organized religions coming in, as opposed to more primitive animism and polytheism.
Correct. I agree. And it wasn't really to me until 5,000. See, I think the difference in 5,000, it's the birth of the state. And to me, until that, religion didn't have what I would call a military. It didn't have this force to go behind the religion. Because once you have statism in a sense, at 5,000 with Egypt and then in Mesopotamia also in the smaller city-states have then become one in a sense. But when they do this, what they do is they take religion along with it. And all of a sudden, for the first time to me, religion becomes law. Not just what people do, but law. Here is, you must worship this goddess, this god in this way at this time. And I mean, it's what everything becomes totally to me a difference. Because anyways, what I'm saying is, I see in a sense the beginning of religion could have been seen as the open wonder, right? Oh, I don't know. I'm kind of, afraid things, could be magical. You don't know. But then you get later when it starts making deeper claims. I know knowledge. I know God. There's this, there's that. There's this kind of God. He wants these kind of things. I mean, it becomes this oppressive thing. It's like, how did it start in wonder and end in oppression?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a natural affinity between the king and the priest, right?
Yes.
So the king protects the priest, but the priest legitimizes the king. And no matter how strong you are, how are you going to rule even a city-state, let alone a nation or an empire, without having people buy into a set of beliefs?
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. They go together.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, if you go all the way back, I was looking at your website where you talk about, the origins of these, the very beginnings.
Oh, you mean like pre-anism? You mean
beliefs? Yeah.
Yeah, like pre-anism with the Homo erectus. That's really interesting to me that from 500 till 300,000, they're collecting these, anthropomorphic, faced stones. What's really interesting though is it's not random. That's what to me is the most interesting. It's not like they just look like human faces. Oh, how interesting. No. Most of the faces, or I should say, probably a better way to say it, a majority of the faces have one eye closed and either no other eye or the other eye open in a sense. Why? I think it has to do with like the death and life. It's like I think of them as almost like
nice.
Almost like it's the beginning of what later becomes the spirit. I think it's like saying these people died. I don't think it was totally magical. I think they thought people died. We feel for them. This little rock is like almost like a gravestone, like a little ancestor stone or something. And I think they carried it around, and that's my speculation, especially because they also took ones of animals and even like wedged little teeth in the cracks to make. I mean, there's one that's like a cheetah. You're like, this thing is like 400,000 years old. It's like intricate kind of thinking, to me at least.
Right.
And I know that they had rudimentary. They've now found even the Homo erectus had, in a sense, rudimentary language. And then what's interesting too is the Homo erectus, in a sense, kind of branches off becomes or is it connected to the Neanderthals. So the Neanderthals, to me, so the Homo erectus, in a sense, in the Homo nati, at 350,000 Homo nati, there's 27 of them found with in a pit. It's like at the end of, I think it's 1.5 miles or something, like cave or some amount of cave. I can't remember exactly, but it's real far in, and then it's a deep drop, and there's 27 bodies, and on top of the body there's one unused red stone tool put like on top. It's almost thought like a commemorative thing, and so that could 350,000 could be like the beginning of a burial almost.
Yeah, I mean that's incredible. The large number of stones with one eye and one eye closed and one eye open. I love your interpretation of that as sort of being a kind of a Janus face. This is life and this is death, and two sides of existence. I think that's really interesting.
I think that we think that these people are stupid, but we forget 1.5 million years ago, or something close to that, we in a sense started randomly using fire. 750 were almost using it like all the time. These people are not stupid. They're thinking, and they're starting to think too. There is baboons, right? I think it's some sort of a primate. Let's put it that way, because I can't remember 100% it's baboons, but I think it is. But I think it's in southern Africa, and they go like a lot of times in the morning up to like a cliff, the highest point, to go watch the sun come up. And so in a sense, they consider almost like an animistic sun worship evidence in these primates. There's also primates that do fire dances when they see fire. There's also primates that do trees. Like they'll go to trees, they'll find a tree they like I guess a sacred tree with a hole in it, and they'll stuff it with rocks. Weird.
Well, yeah.
I mean, I think that is like early religion. And I think that's what I'm saying when I relate to like what the Homo erectus is doing. Do I really think when they put in the rocks in the tree that they are worshiping the tree? It's possible, but who knows? But it's something. It's not nothing.
Yeah, I think there's a very interesting fact about primate psychology, or at least human psychology, and it ties in really well with your thesis on animism.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with the discussion about agency over detection. So the idea is an agent is a being
right.
that has a will and an intention.
Right.
Right. So a rock is not an agent, but a
Correct.
hungry bear is an agent. And if you think about human evolution, right, you catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of your eye. It could have been a shadow, or it could have been a hungry bear.
Correct.
Now, if you interpret it as a shadow, you might get eaten.
Mm-hmm.
But if you interpret it as a hungry bear and it turns out just to be a shadow, well, no harm done. So over a long period of evolution, people who were more likely to interpret things as hungry bears, in other words, they were more prone to see agents.
Correct.
Those were the people who would survive and reproduce. So over a long period of evolution, we're hardwired to detect agency in our environment. And so we naturally think that, if you've ever yelled at your car or your lawnmower or your computer, it's inbuilt into us
Yes.
to assume that these things have attitudes towards us, when in fact they're just stupid objects.
Yep.
And so I see that as a sort of a fragment or a rudiment of a religious belief.
I totally agree. So what I would say is that God beliefs need superstition, but superstition does not need God beliefs. And so,
Sure.
So that it built, to me, it starts all in superstition, because animals have superstitions, even like birds. There's been this behavioral study where they a bird did a behavior and they gave it food or something. So then the bird starts thinking that behavior produces food.
Yeah.
But that's the same, in a sense, presuppositional error that humans make. It's the same exact error. We think that because we do some agency in the world, like rain dance, rain happens. It's a total fallacy. But it's not one that even just humans are limited. That's what I'm saying. It's animals. Because I think that, in a sense, how I see it is people experience the world through their phenomenology, which is like the relation they have with the phenomena. That's very important, though, because phenomenology doesn't actually mean it's accurate. It just means it's your feelings, in a sense. In other words, like when you look at a painting of a window, there's no window there. It's just a blank wall. It's a flat thing. But when you look at this picture, especially if it has mountains and trees, and you start to feel a phenomenological experience of the outside. It's not real, but you experience it. Now, I think that this is a very key thing to what religious people do. They say, Damien, I feel a spiritual experience. And I go, I agree. Your phenomenology is making you feel this. I totally agree. Problem is, though, you can't trust phenomenology to be an accuracy of reality.
Yeah, no, exactly. And so if we go back to, your idea about the king and the priest,
right.
And religion being about what you have to believe, it seems to me that Christianity really perfected that idea with today's topic, which is the idea of hell.
Oh, it definitely did.
It's pretty hard to beat that as a penalty, you know?
Well, I think that also, I know you talked about in your book, Seeing Through Christianity, a critique of beliefs and evidence, which I like the fact that you address both beliefs and evidence, because I think those are two separate things that we do need to address. And I think that also goes to the place of hell to me, and the fact that, let's just say that hell was a place. When was it created? Was it created before the beginning of the world, or was it created after? This is important to me because that already starts addressing the, if it was an actual thing, it needs actual elements to it. And to me, I feel like even like I'm an agnostic with an I, or a theological non-cognitivist, sort of. But a theological non-cognitivist, why I think agnostic is a little bit different. In a sense, a theological non-cognitivist is when you say words like soul, afterlife, God, those are not meaningful words. There's only this life. There's no magic. There's no element to call soul. So when you say those words, it's meaningless. It's not cognitively real. It's just like your mental aspirations. But, with an agnostic, it takes that and then it goes, now I'm going to challenge you with it, in a sense, to me. It's more of an atheist position and further away from just like the thinking one. See what I'm saying? So to me, that's why I think it's important, things like hell. When someone offers me this idea, the first thing I do is I always attach it. What is the ontology? What am I being offered? I don't even let the words get by. Now I'm talking to you, a reasonable person, but if I'm talking to someone who's trying to push nonsense, one way to stop them, like you're doing here, is address the beliefs and address the evidence. And I think that's the process we should do it in. First thing that offered the belief, I believe in hell. Okay. When was hell invented? And why?
Yeah.
Because if you're saying it wasn't invented after the fall of man, supposedly, or did God know that the fall of man was going to happen, create hell in advance before we even fell? Now, wouldn't that be a sick thought? Because I would say, okay, but is your God a moral God? If I was to create a product that I know was going to cause massive suffering, and I knew in advance it was going to cause massive suffering, and I still created it, what would be the moral duty of someone judging me?
Exactly. And why would, or conversely, why would a God even bother creating people, individuals who he knew in advance were not going to believe in him, and
That's
he
right.
would then be obligated to consign them to this place that he had created for them.
A loving God wouldn't. But that would mean that we already know that the loving God is off the table. But that only would leave a non-loving God. But a non-loving God, what benefit would a non-loving God, if real, to stay invisible? Because, a loving God would not hide. We can all establish that. Because communication and relationship is a part of love. To use that word love without relationship or communication would lose its meaning.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. The problem of hiddenness is something, even Christian philosophers will acknowledge, that's a problem. Where is he? Well, if he created this, I once heard a comedian say, if God created humans for his own entertainment, then you could at least say, well, we've held up our end of the bargain, right?
Well,
human history.
Well, exactly. And let's just assume that hell was an ethical thing. But see, if it's an ethical thing, it has to be built on ethical standards. What that would mean, though, is that if someone would have to, in a sense, deserve the torture. So can we think of a thing that would deserve universal torture? Well, I can think of one, genocide, right? Everyone could probably agree, oh yeah, genocide, definitely. Well, great. Now that you agree with that, you can agree that your God is the worst, if true, the worst genocidal maniac that's ever been on this planet. Because he's claimed that he killed everyone on the planet. You can't get better than that. That would be the worst, most heinous being ever in existence.
Yeah, the flood.
That's right, the flood.
Pretty heinous crime. And you know why we have rainbows, right? According to Genesis, is to remind God not to get so angry that he's going to kill everybody again. So, the whole thing is an interesting process.
Well, it just like the hell, it brings up that no moral God would even invent hell. That the act of you claiming a hell removes the possibility of a loving God. And the interesting too is hell, everyone always assumes that somehow God is just. Like I was trying to say, what is the ethical standard for hell? Well, let's look at Jesus Ethics 101. So in Jesus' opinion, differences of opinion deserve eternal torture. So we have to assess, is that moral though? So this is what Matthew 5:22 says. Anyone, remember this is anyone, so he's not leaving nobody out, who says, you fool, because of course that's the most worst that you can say, will be in disaster of fire of hell. So someone, this is the thing. Imagine going to court and your crime is you've said you fool. Bill, you said you fool to Damien because one of his ideas you didn't agree with. You deserve everlasting, excruciating torture as your punishment. I mean, anyone that watched that would be like, wow, that's not a just court, decision. What has Bill done? Bill's done nothing. What, thought crime? Oh, you got to be kidding me. And even if it's a thought crime, how bad was a thought crime is just calling me a fool? Okay, you don't agree. All right, Bill. Well, we're still friends. Cool. You don't agree with something. Not the end of the world. I don't go, Bill, you need to suffer for eternity. Torture. I mean, what kind of a unethical, unloving, sick person even would think that or desire that?
Yeah, I mean, even the human framers of the Constitution and the First Amendment could see that, punishing people for things that they say is ridiculous.
Exactly. So, could you read a little bit from your book on hell, so that the listeners can get a little better understanding of your take on it, and then we'll talk about it a little bit, and then I'll give my interpretation?
Sure. As I said, the first part of the book, Seeing Through Christianity, a critique of beliefs and evidence, breaks down Christian doctrines and into short, I think they're pretty digestible chunks. This little short chapter on hell is only 4 pages long, so I'll just go ahead and...
Oh, yeah, go ahead and read it for us, please.
Yeah. Christianity teaches that those judged unfavorably, the majority of humankind, will be punished in an afterlife of perpetual fire. Jesus says, fear him who, after your body has been killed, has authority to throw you into hell. Luke 12:5, quote, where the fire never goes out. Mark 9:43. This doctrine enters the Bible only in the New Testament. It is never mentioned in the Old Testament. The God of the Old Testament is vengeful, and if you anger him, he will kill you. But the God of the New Testament is far more vengeful, and if you anger him, he will torture you for eternity. Hell is a peculiar idea, and its prevalence is almost accidental. In traditional Jewish thought, the afterlife was not differentiated into separate places for reward and punishment. That idea most likely came into Palestine from Zoroastrianism. It was slow to gain currency in mainstream Judaism, but it became popular among Jewish apocalyptic thinkers during the last centuries BCE. Jesus incorporated this idea into his teachings, and through him it infected the whole of Western civilization. For the ancient Israelites, heaven was God's abode, not an afterlife destination. The spirits of the dead, they believed, occupied a realm called Sheol, where they existed in a disembodied and semi-conscious state. Sheol differed from the afterlife of Christianity in 2 fundamental ways. First, it was the end of any meaningful experience, consisting of neither suffering nor pleasure. Second, it was the end of the line for everyone, the virtuous and the wicked alike. There was no differentiation based on prior conduct in life. Life itself was where one received divine rewards and punishments. Deuteronomy 28. Job is a perfect example. He suffered greatly, yet remained loyal to his God. After all of that, it is nowhere suggested that he would be compensated in an afterlife. Instead, his fortune was restored in life. Quote, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. and so Job died, an old man full of years. I should add in a footnote, some versions of the Bible, most notably the King James, incorrectly translate the Jewish Bible Old Testament word Sheol as hell. This error has the effect of disguising the fact, for English language readers, that the Old and New Testaments have very different conceptions of the afterlife. So during the post-exilic period, this is after the Jews returned from Babylon, under Persian influence, a different conception took root. Zoroastrianism teaches that human conduct is part of the cosmic war between the forces of light under Ahura Mazda and those of darkness under Ahriman. Every human decision with a moral dimension contributes to one side or the other of this titanic struggle. Consequently, Zoroastrianism places a high value on moral conduct. When Ahura Mazda eventually triumphs, everyone will be judged. The good will be welcomed to paradise, and the bad hurled into a pit of torment. Jewish apocalyptic thinkers adopted the notion of a coming judgment that would determine everyone's afterlife destinations. They developed the belief that the righteous would be resurrected, but that the rest of Israel would remain in Sheol. In fact, the only reference in the Old Testament to a differentiated afterlife comes in the apocalyptic writing Daniel, written circa 165 BCE. For these thinkers, Sheol began to be associated with Gehenna, an actual place where one of Israel's enemies had sacrificed children in fire to propitiate the god Moloch. The association with Moloch may be the origin of Christianity's odd notion of hellfire. After all, humans generally regard fire as positively as a source of light and warmth and as a means of protection and cooking. In the Greek world, Prometheus was revered because at great personal sacrifice he brought the gift of fire to humankind. In Zoroastrianism, the good forces of light battle the bad forces of darkness.
Right, yeah.
Accordingly, that religion venerates the two main sources of light, the sun and fire. Fire does not figure prominently, if at all, in the Zoroastrian pit of torment. While Christianity also conceives of forces of light battling forces of darkness, it does not view fire positively, focusing instead on its destructive aspects. This may be due to the coalescence of Sheol and Gehenna in Jewish apocalyptic thought and the subsequent transmission of this prejudice to Christianity. Does the idea of hell make sense? It appears to be incompatible with a God of love and justice. First, as discussed in the previous chapter, people are not sent to hell for being evil. They are sent to hell for failing to believe in Jesus.
Exactly.
Billions of devout Muslims, Hindus, and others live decent lives and worship a God, or even several of them. As a reward for their piety, they will be devoured ceaselessly in a lake of fire. The author of such a plan might well tremble at the prospect of a judgment himself. Second, if people are guilty of crimes, even real ones rather than simply failing the faith in Jesus test, they are finite crimes. Infinite punishment for finite crimes is unjust.
That's right.
After burning for, say, 1 billion years, wouldn't the point have been made? Because there's no chance of release from the Christian hell, its purpose cannot be rehabilitation, but only retribution.
That's right.
By contrast, in Zoroastrianism, no soul remains in torment for eternity. All are ultimately invited into paradise. Anything less would detract from the triumph of the good. If a deity actually sent people to hell permanently, he could not be described as either loving or just. Would a loving parent torture his children for misbehaving? Even if one argues that those failing the faith in Jesus test are not true children of God, the question then becomes whether a loving parent would torture someone else's children. Uncomfortable with reflections of this nature, many Christians respond by adopting either a hard line or a soft line perspective. The hard line perspective is to argue that people in hell deserve to remain there forever because they continue to sin. For example, in their agony, they curse the God who put them there. This is not persuasive in the least. Individuals sent to hell would have, at that point, ample evidence of the existence of this God and of the behavior he requires. It is implausible in the extreme to believe that not a single one of them would ask for forgiveness and promise to correct his behavior if given a chance to do so.
Yeah.
A soft-line perspective is to argue that the Christian God is not really too keen on the idea of hell either. Apologists say things such as, quote, he offers people a way out of hell, quote, or, quote, he won't force anyone to go to heaven against his will, end quote. But this is really a dishonest argument, an attempt to insulate the Christian God from Christianity's own teachings. It implies that hell is a natural default destination, that the God has nothing to do with its occupancy, and that his paramount concern is to respect free will. This argument fails both scripturally and logically. As shown in the quotations with which this chapter began, Jesus is not describing a default mechanism. The God is proactively throwing people into hell. And free will is clearly not his priority. The Bible recounts numerous instances of this God interfering with people's free will. Check out Exodus 7:3, Deuteronomy 2:30. Logically, if a just God really wanted to respect people's free will not to go to heaven, then he could simply provide an alternative to eternal torture, a neutral place. Not heaven, but not hell either. Finally, a bizarre hybrid argument is to claim that by sending people to hell, the God is being merciful, because for those people, being with God in heaven is even more unbearable than being in hell. This makes no sense. Hell is customarily defined as the worst possible torment. A God bestowing mercy would not put anyone there. Moreover, and once again, why should this God be constrained to only two alternatives? He could provide a neutral place or simply oblivion, rather than confining himself to an unimaginative, two-tiered afterlife. Apparently, without noticing the irony, Christians routinely thank their God for saving them. Saving them from what? He's saving them from eternal torture, something that he himself created or allows to exist. That is like thanking a firefighter for putting out a fire that he himself started.
Yeah. Or threats to kill your whole family with the fire.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's an interesting question, right? Even those people who, let's say you have a family and one family member is a Christian, that person's in heaven, but then that person has to watch the rest of his or her family being tortured for eternity in hell. So it's not really clear what kind of heaven that's going to be for the Christian.
Well, I think that kind of says that heaven is basically, that's why I always think it's funny. They always think that somehow heaven's a wonderful place. It's a place where you can have castles and whatever. Okay, great. But the whole point of the castle is not your enjoyment, your wealth. I mean, you don't actually believe as a Christian, you go to hell and you get rewarded and treated wonderful and back rubs and get fed grapes. If you remember, the whole point of heaven is actually for you to worship God. So you'll spend the rest of your life, berating yourself for God. And that is what's supposed to be the most wonderful thing, that you get to actually be in the presence of Jesus.
Yeah, no, it's not like being at a 5-star resort.
Right. That's what you'll think, though. It seems like.
Yeah.
Like it's some kind of reward. It's not a reward. It's actually the removal of threat as the way it's presented. Because imagine if a king were to come and take over right now. Let's say that Saudi Arabia attacked America and somehow won. And now we're under that king. And he says we're going to behead all atheists unless you become, a Muslim under this kingship. And we say no, and we're killed. Would we say that this is a moral king? A good king? No. And if he did it to our family, but said, we'll let you survive because you're willing to, but because Damien's not, we'll kill him or your family. I mean, if your family and friends could be killed like that, how is that any different than, say, Nazi Germany? And I know people don't like to bring that up, but I mean, how is it different? If you're going to give a moral standard, they always say that we're the ones that are somehow, have a relative moral standard. Really? Because you do. You out of your own mouth go, killing is wrong, but God kills, and it's not wrong. And there's nothing else. There's no, reasonable justification. It just is. In other words, if God said rape, and he does say to rape in the Bible, or at least he condones it. And Jesus certainly didn't feel any need to go, yeah, don't do that. He just said, don't stone women who, in a sense, have sex willingly. So, it's very interesting about women, I think, is the issue that people, at least for me. So, like you talked about Zoroastrianism. So for me, the Siberia basically goes in at 7,000 to 5,000 years ago, invades all of Europe. So all your Germanic myths are actually Siberian myths, passed from shamanism into paganism. So, and this happens multiple times. The first time, to me, is 16,000 years ago. The shamans go into northern Iran and start to build communities. They very quickly, I don't know exactly, but it's like by 14,000 something for sure, they're already in Turkey. They just moved. And then they keep moving more south and more central Turkey at 14,000 because they start mining obsidian. And obsidian starts from that point, 14,000, starts flowing down into areas of Israel and Mesopotamia from Turkey. This is also why Turkey becomes a major source of religion to me. All religion has been touched in the sense that we think of today by Turkey. So, but it's actually originally from Siberia, because the shamans actually come from Siberia, and they come down. You can tell this by genetically, you can tell this by language, you can tell by archaeological records for the artifacts, the stone tool use. You can also tell by the pottery and the way the pottery is done, and then also by the goddess figurines that were prominent. But speaking of goddess, to me, religion, like especially monotheism, there to me isn't any monotheism that's not monotheism. And so to me, monotheism starts 5,000 years ago in a sense hardcore, and the elements for it. In other words, like I said, to me, animism is at least 100,000, but the elements are at least 300,000. It's way up more than that. Same thing in a sense to me with monotheism. Probably comes out somewhere, at maybe 3,000 or 4,000, but 5,000 that I think is where the elements started. Because once you said a male king passes down the throne, you started making the emphasis man. And also I think war starts at 10,000 battles. That's why at 9,000 you have that walls of Jericho being built and towers to see things and stuff, because you're starting to have, but Jericho was actually not in itself like a city. So Jericho has a production ability higher than the city would be able to utilize. So it has to be selling, but it doesn't have a lot of wealth, but it's making products. So if it's making products, it doesn't have a lot of wealth, and it has a connection to Turkey. To me, the society is already more developed, advanced in Turkey, because the first human-made temple is 12,000 at least, 13,000 in Göbekli Tepe. The first religious city in the world is in central Turkey, which is Catalhawk, and those ideas from there bleed down. So at 9,000, there's Turkey people, in a sense, the genetics, leaves Turkey and goes over to Crete, becomes the Minoans. Then they interact with the Greeks. And also the Greeks at 8,000, there's already cattle being taken from Western Turkey over into Greek genetically. And then the artifacts spread. So, but the thing is that it all starts in shamanism. And shamanism, people need to understand, is almost, especially at the beginning, almost exclusively women. I mean, there's almost no male shamans. At least if you look at the archaeological record, 30,000 years ago in Siberia, there's a female shaman burial with one eye closed and one eye damaged, living a little, the oldest, in a sense, portrait in the world. There's a little portrait buried with her. It was like a little stone thing, or not, it was a bone. Sorry, not stone. A little bone carving of, in a sense, her face. And like I said, it's interesting, like, because the Homo erectus did the one eye closed and one eye open. I don't think that it's a direct thing because that's too far, but it's similar in the sense of, because it's the meaning is the same to me. It's still trying to mean, and see, in shamanism, they think that if you're damaged, especially like your eyes, somehow then you have a special ability to see like into the spirit world, which of course wouldn't make sense. But because you can't see, but they just think that damage actually is a good thing, which is an interesting concept. They usually think that someone who's a shaman is someone who's experienced trauma or something. That's how come they're special and they know more. But anyway, so
I like your comment about the masculine attitude that most of these religions took on at a certain point. Once you have kings or even tribal chieftains, it's really easy to see in most polytheistic religions, the pantheon is a projection of the human nuclear family.
Yeah.
So we project ideas of the father and the mother and all the kids, all the siblings, then onto all the supernatural powers.
Right, but what I'm saying is at one time there was no male. There was only female and animals. Yeah. In a sense. There was no god. There was goddesses and animals. And the reason why this goes back to the snake. So the reason the snake and women are connected is because, in a sense, how I see ethnographically, and with archaeological evidence, it seems to relate to this, that the umbilical cord and the snake are related. And that's why they think the snake and the woman are connected, because the woman gives a snake, in a sense, to the child to produce life, in a sense. And so, to me, that the first human worship ever is in South Africa about 70,000 years ago. And guess what? Stone, snake, or serpent, or whatever. And but what's really, why I want to bring this up is because all this is about the Bible too. Because I want to show that there's a snake connection, tree connection, goddess connection. So guess what hell in Nordic is? Hel is a goddess of the underworld, or just underworld in general, or what's considered to be in Old Norse kind of like hidden, the hidden place, hidden thing, or the grave. And so to me, I think that's why it's interesting, because what she's supposedly, this goddess or whatever, supposed to do is actually that she's cruel, greedy, harsh, or at least indifferent to the concerns of the living or the dead. But I was thinking that the cruel and the harsh almost sounds like the beginning of Satan, in a sense. And I wanted to say too that people don't realize that the object of this devil worship and Satan is not connected. I mean, it's connected now. But in a sense, devil worship is way it's about, I don't know exactly, but let's just say 9,000, 10,000 years ago, maybe older. I mean, it's definitely pre-Christian way. But how they viewed it is more like tricksters, not like even like this one, where it doesn't say that she's like torturing people, it just says greedy, harsh, cruel. You know what I'm saying? In a sense, indifferent. So and that's how, to me, that they viewed, in a sense, devils, or they're tricksters, that They operate in the world because it's animistic thinking. They operate in the world and they do these when bad things. Oh, there's an earthquake. Oh, it must have been tricksters, or we need to be careful because they'll get us.
Joseph Campbell, was fond of making the point that tricksters were very common.
Oh, yes.
And that one of the role the tricksters played was to remind us that we're not so smart. Every time humans think they have everything all figured out, the trickster comes along and messes us up just to teach us a lesson. But the idea of a true malevolence really doesn't come along until you have the beginnings of monotheism.
I totally agree. Yes, I agree.
When you have monotheism, then you say, well, the God is good. Well, then how do you explain suffering and
then
bad
you make
things?
the bad.
Then you need to localize all those bad things. You need to put it into a locus, a reification, and that's where this devil idea comes.
And you know why I think that happened? Was actually Greece. And the reason I think it happened was philosophers. I think until about 2,500 years ago, in a sense, no one was making any direct charge at religion is possibly, or gods aren't true. So you start to have people in philosophy almost the same time as the New Testament saying, wait a minute, because Paul knew there was philosophers. I mean, he's living in Turkey, speaking of which is interesting. And he's from Turkey. But what's interesting is that if he was real, because I would always think it's funny how there's the mythicist for Jesus. How about the mythicist for Paul? Really, do we have any good evidence for Paul?
Interesting, yeah.
No, I read a whole thing about the myth of Paul. I was like, why never heard anyone say that before? But but it's interesting because why believe any of this?
Stuff, or allegedly wrote some stuff. The only time Jesus wrote anything was when he scratched something in the sand in the woman taken in adultery episode in the Gospel of John. Yeah. Other than that, we wouldn't have any idea he could write.
But we're supposed to believe that he intercedes on our behalf to remove us from hell, right? This person who didn't even let's just assume that he could write in the sand. if he could write in the sand, then he could write a lot in the sand, or at least he should do it every time he goes somewhere or leave. You know what I'm saying? Because just think, you could draw pictures. Let's just say you couldn't communicate at all your actual. You could draw pictures. You could still. And the thing is, why is it that Jesus never asked anyone to make the Bible? I mean, never. There's no even if we believe every single gospel, please tell me where in the gospel it says, "Oh yeah, please produce the Bible."
Very good point. Yeah.
So because it just think go ahead.
It took 400 years for Christianity to agree on which books to include and which books to exclude from the New Testament. And even today, there's disagreement between Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox about which books are in the Old Testament.
Exactly.
So, the fact that it's a human product is undisputable.
It is, and just think: is it a human product that would, if we had a clean slate as a reasonable person, is it a human product we would invent? And if we were able to, like supposedly God can do, see the result of this product's harm, would we still want to produce it? And could we, if we did, would we be an ethical person?
To the hiddenness argument, right? Because why would a loving God sit back and allow errors to be propagated in his name?
No way.
And you've got religions contradicting each other and religious wars and so on. So why doesn't he set the record straight?
Well, you can't get out of it, because this is what people, I think, the Christians especially, it's like they go, "Oh, you're going to hell." I go, do you know that if, just for a second, let's assume everything you believe about is true, why are you celebrating my suffering? And then saying you're a good person. Do good people celebrate the suffering of others?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. And a lot of times you'll hear, atheists will say, "Well, heaven, that's wishful thinking." And then Christians will respond, by saying, "Oh, it's not wishful thinking because we believe in hell too." But actually that is wishful thinking, because they don't see themselves going there. They just see the people they disagree with going there.
Yeah. Well, and what's really interesting is I don't even think you get all Christians to agree who should go to hell.
Yeah, well, and some Christians are universalists. They actually believe that everyone eventually will get to heaven. And then there are others who take Jesus' words literally when he said, "Narrow is the gate, only a few shall pass through." So again, you have intramural differences among Christians, and it's not clear why a loving God would allow those differences, particularly among those who most want to follow him, to persist.
Yeah, and just think of how would you know that a God was loving? Let's just assume that I feel like they start with this presupposition flaw that God is automatically loving before they even explain it. Well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to justify that a God is loving. And if you look at God, I always think is, let's assume it's not your God, Bill. Let's assume it's some other God. I'm going to offer you God XYZ. You don't know God's name. It's God, okay. God XYZ. And he does these behaviors. Is this a God worth following? And if you were able to rationally assess it, I don't think any Christian, if they're truly a loving, caring person, would want to follow God. Even if the God was real. Because of what the actual things are, if they just plainly looked at what it was and didn't know, that this God, because what if we're talking about, Aro Mazda, or, we're talking about Pele? Well, what is the God? God is Pele. How do you know?
Yeah.
Maybe it's Jesus, maybe it's not,
Well, and it goes back to the Homer Simpson argument, right? Because there's lots of different gods, so if you're worshiping the wrong one, you're making the real one matter and matter and matter.
Exactly. And how bad can it be someone like Bill just going, well, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem ethical. I mean, what God, if they're a rational, loving God, what God would have a problem with that? Seriously.
Yeah, I mean, you would think if he created our intellects, presumably he gave us our intellects to protect us from false beliefs or, walking off cliffs and eating stones. Presumably he doesn't want us believing in false beings also. So it seems like we would be commended for our efforts.
Exactly. That we want, and I always tell people it's interesting. I'm more than willing to understand things if they're ethical, but I won't accept pseudo-ethics pushed on me like as if they're ethics. And how I see it is this. To me, morality is like a general heading, okay? Then inside of that is morals and ethics. And I see, because just think, is there business morals? No, there's business ethics. And that relates why I think there's a difference. Ethics to me has to do with the social exchange we do among people. And so it's a behavior in a sense. And then morals to me is your personal values, not your world values. So the problem with Christians and with a lot of religions, or I should almost say all religions practically, is that they take the personal moral and they say the world needs to live by my personal morals. Not what's ethical, but my personal morals. Yeah, well, that's ridiculous. Plus, which Christian gets to choose which is the morals? Because it is not like Jesus laid out A, B, C, D, and F. And even if you try to say Ten Commandments, does that really? Have you read the Ten Commandments? Because there's not a lot of ethics in the Ten Commandments. There's a lot of claims, and I think it's interesting. Let's just assume it's an ethical document. Well, then certainly I would want to make sure that you understand that one is the worst, right? The worst. But if we go down, why is child disobeying the parents above murder? I mean, what? Really? Who would put murder under? So a child disobeying the parents is worse than murder? I mean, really? And you can read that and go, oh, loving God. Oh my, in fact, the perfect being. Yeah, I don't think so. I think if you're a rational person, you got to go, yeah, why would you even add that? I mean, of all the things, child not obeying the parents, let's see, how many childs are not going to obey the parents? 100% out of 100. So we already have a problem. Because, you know what I'm saying? I mean, so all children, what? Because remember, the punishment for a child disobeying their parents is what? Death. Not only their death, but I even think it's in the Ten Commandments, it's the only punishment that listed, in a sense. Like, all of them are, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But when it gets to parents, if you don't do parents, you'll be punished for the 7th generation or something like that. Or 7 months, I can't remember now exactly, or 3rd generation or something. It's not like, wait a minute, not only are you punishing the child, you're saying the child's children is going to get punished too, or whatever? Or what?
Well, that's a really interesting point, this idea about punishing to the 4th generation.
Yeah.
And they mention it in 3 different places in the Old Testament. And I always point that out as evidence for the fact that, as I read in the chapter, early on within Jewish belief, there was no heaven and hell. There was just Sheol. And everybody went to Sheol, good and bad alike, Jew and non-Jew alike. And once you were in Sheol, God couldn't get at you. And so when they wanted to make the penalty for something really, really bad, notice they didn't say, you'll be punished in hell.
Right.
Rather, They said, we're going to punish your parents, your grandparents, your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. So that was like the last resort of a scoundrel. That was the kind of threat that would be made by a God who did not have an afterlife at his disposal. He couldn't punish you in hell because at that point in time, the Jews hadn't developed that idea because they hadn't yet been exposed to the Zoroastrian differentiation concept.
Right, and Zoroastrianism, to me, also is actually not originating in Iran. It originates, once again, to me, the elements of it originate in Siberia. So Siberia had these horse marauders, in a sense. They would go to the Scythians. They basically had some of a whole bunch of areas. Northern Iran was just part of it. Siberia, I think some Indochina or Mongolia a little bit, and a little bit, I think, Afghanistan, a little bit of maybe Pakistan or so. But it's a big. It had, and in fact, they end up, that people also are the people that went into northern Pakistan and western and northern India and Afghanistan, southern Afghanistan, and made the Harpin culture, in a sense. I'm not always saying the terms right, but I believe that's what it's called. But anyways, that became, in a sense, Hinduism and then later Buddhism. It's very important, too, because Buddha actually is lineage is reportedly Scythian. And so he was actually not even Indian inherently, because he would have been either some form of Siberian or he would have been Iranian. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because my research on Zoroastrianism sort of traces the history back, as you say, to the southern steppes of Russia.
Yes.
And you have a migration.
Oh, yes.
The Indo-European migration, where people came down into India and Iran.
Yep.
And nobody knew about this until the mid-1900s, when a really gifted linguist noticed that the linguistic similarities between Sanskrit and Greek, and that led to the idea that they spoke a common language which they call Proto-Indo-European.
That's right.
That's why you have the Indo-European family of languages, and all of that has subsequently been verified, as you said, by DNA evidence.
Sure has.
And so the oldest Zoroastrian writings, the Avesta, is very similar to Sanskrit. It's very similar to the language.
Well, they have some of the same
Veda
deities. They have some of the same deity names. They have some of the same terms. I already know this too. It's in my book, because I just reference it lightly because I care about how we got here more than like what happened now. But yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. And what's interesting to me is that that's why some of the ideas, in a sense of like, let's say, people don't understand the Norse have, like I was just saying about the hell, Hel, the goddess, and also the place, which is so funny because hell, we say, is just one extra L. It's almost the same. It's almost the same word. And so, but the hell was considered to be the goddess was half black, half white. Well, if you look at the symbol for like the yin and the yang is half black and half white. I'm just saying it's an interesting thing, and I think that also could be like the light and darkness, is in referencing death and life.
Yeah, and it goes back to the stones with one eye open
yes,
and one eye closed.
Death and life.
There's a fascination with this duality.
Yes, there is.
That's at the root of a lot of religious thinking.
I completely agree. I think also what's interesting is that hell, heaven, and the power of imagination in general, because hell is an imaginary place to put people who you don't like and to control the minds of, say, children and stuff, to get them to believe your nonsense. It's a great tool, because what they're doing is they're hijacking like innate fear. And actually, like you said too, in a sense, innate wonder or awe of life and death.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening is that the political elites harness that innate fear for their own control purposes. So it enables you to direct the society.
Yeah, because I mean, wasn't it C.S. Lewis that said that I fear not that God is not true, but that what kind of God I worship, or something like that? It was some kind of statement like that. He's like, I really don't want to think about it. I think.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
I can't remember the exact phrase, so nobody quote me on it, but it's something along that lines. Like he was saying, like, I don't doubt. My problem is not doubting God. It's realizing really who God is. And he meant it not in a good way, like that maybe God is not a good God in a sense. That's the fear, not the fear that he wouldn't believe, but the God that he does believe is actually not a good God. And I think that if it was real, it wouldn't be a good God. And it doesn't. The only thing not coming to that conclusion is just bias.
Yeah, doesn't one of Paul's letters say you judge them by their works?
Exactly.
So
let's judge them. Let's judge by God.
Created this world, and there's a lot of evil and suffering. Now, of course, Christians will justify that. They'll say we're fallen, and so on. So that's a way of sort of getting God out of getting God out of the penalty box is a theodicy.
Yeah, but that's also because they have an illogical thinking and haven't analyzed properly the beginning to start. So, okay, let's assume that falls are possible. But when did that happen? You mean when someone ate the apple? Okay, let's assume something. The tree was there, right? Okay, and had no way of guarding this supposed toxic substance. that these non-moral beings didn't know a morality to assess properly. So, but let's assume that they didn't. Let's assume Adam and Eve didn't eat the tree. Does the tree go away? Does God go yay and start throwing out things and celebration? Ah, la 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 la. I don't think so. No, what would happen if Adam and Eve didn't? The tree would go nowhere. Even if 1,000 generations did not eat the tree and were good people, see, it was a booby trap, because once the tree was eaten, God wanted to punish all of humanity. And that alone, I don't need to read any more of the Bible to know that's not a good God.
Yeah, and of course it was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So in other words, they didn't know it was wrong to disobey the God by eating the fruit,
Yes.
because they hadn't eaten the fruit yet. So how could it be moral to punish them for something that they didn't know was wrong?
Right. So God's design was that we would not be born moral, because we weren't given morals at birth, though we were supposedly given morals after we ate the tree. So God's design was never for us to be moral beings. I mean, why doesn't that bother Christians? And then when we became moral beings, that's when we got punished, not before. Like, what?
Yeah, I've even heard there's this idea of the felicitous fall. I can't remember how it's said in Latin, but this idea that actually it all worked out for the best, because if humankind hadn't fallen, then Jesus wouldn't have been able to come and save us. So wrap your head around that.
Well, yeah, the whole thing. The thing that they don't get is that the claim of hell is not just ridiculous; it's immoral. It's not just false. How can they not? The concept of God that would do that is ethically vile. I mean, I don't understand why it would just be to me. It should be ethically vile to anyone. In other words, let's just say another God came and killed their God. Jesus is dead. God, this other God is the real God. Killed your God. Now it decides it's going to put you in hell, like you were saying before, because you were worshiping this thing. And you say, yeah, but I was doing the right thing. I was following Jesus. And he goes, yeah, well, Jesus is dead now. You should have followed me. And I'm actually irritated that you ever followed that Jesus. Would they feel that God, because this is the point I'm trying to make. They say this nonsense. They go, well, God made you, so he has the right over you. Or God made the universe, so he's the ultimate power. Okay, so if another power came, let's just say Satan became more powerful, took over God. Now Satan's the most power. Would you now say that Satan should be worshipped just because he has the power of creation? Or do we judge him by his actions?
Yeah, I think theists frequently slip into a might makes right kind of argument with that.
But that would mean another God, then they would have to agree, they would have to be logically consistent, that if another God that was more powerful than their God came and killed their God and took over and was now the God, would they just go, well, thank you, oh Master Bill, for saving us from Jesus. Thank you that you don't kill us and put us in hell like you put Damien. You know, would they just switch like that? Because might makes right. I mean, God makes the power, right? What does it matter which God it is to them? Do they care about the quality of their God, or just that their God was given to them and they like it?
Right. I mean, you point out that the difficulty with the moral argument for hell. And I guess the only response that I've heard from Christians that makes sense is sort of it makes sense. The best argument that I've heard from Christians is that it's separation from God.
Right.
Now, that's an interesting question. So are we all? Does that mean we're all in hell now because we're all separated from God now? Because that gets back to his hiddenness. Because I'm not seeing him. Maybe I'm in hell now, but maybe a Christian isn't. Yeah, so then it's just a psychological state, and then you completely demythologize the whole belief system.
Well, yeah, and once you do that, there is no religion, because in a sense, Christianity is nothing but a bunch of myth belief system. It's not a reality system. I mean, it tries to claim it as such, but it's not. I mean, you couldn't use the book to. I think it was that funny too. People, Christianity saves or Jesus saves. No, medical science saves, and it doesn't use Jesus to do that actually. And in fact, just think, if I said, to a person who's a Christian, okay, your child just got in this car accident. What would you like me to take you to the hospital or the church so the pastors can do some praying? I don't think, and so that's why I think it's very interesting, because if prayer was real, if God was so real, if Christianity was so real, where's the prayer hospitals? I mean, seriously.
Yeah, well, prayer is a whole other topic, because there have been scientific studies on the efficacy of prayer, and none of them have ever shown any result.
Well, I know there was a study they did where there was actually where they heart patients, and they I think it was in 2012, but it was heart patients, and they told some people that they were being prayed for. We're praying for you. And they told, they didn't tell these other people who were being prayed for, but they didn't know. Then the other people, they told them, we're not praying for you. What's interesting is the people that were told they got prayed for, they did worse than anyone. And they called it prayer anxiety, that people were feeling more stress that God wasn't, going to help them, and they ended up getting sicker or being more. I think that so not only does prayer not work, people, hearing you're being prayed about and not seeing the evidence, like Bill says in his book, right? His book, Seeing Through Christianity, a critique of the beliefs and evidence. See, the belief is bad. The evidence is not there.
Yeah, very good point. You're referring to the what's called the STEP study. It's called the therapeutic effects of intercessory prayer.
Exactly.
And it was people recovering from coronary bypass surgery. And this was a major study. 6 major U.S. hospitals and Christian groups volunteered to participate, to do the praying. And it found no effect.
Yeah.
So, it's kind of hard to argue with that. And getting back to your example of the parents with a child that had been, in an accident and needed to go to the hospital, the Bible is pretty clear that what you ask for, you will receive.
Oh, yeah.
It says here, Mark 11:24, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it and it will be yours. End quote. Matthew 21:22, if you believe, you will receive whatever you ask for in prayer. End quote. Those promises are clear, unambiguous. They have no exceptions noted, and yet they failed empirical testing over and over.
Right. The reason I brought up hell prayer in relation to hell is because, to me, in a sense, if there's hell, right? So God created hell if we don't pray that Jesus saves us.
Yeah. Yeah, why not just cut out the middleman and get rid of the hell, and you don't have a need for Jesus?
Yeah, I always think it's funny. They always go, well, won't you go and see, the positive things in religion, Damien? Because I'm a very anti-religionist. And I go, I do see the reality of religion. And so it depends on what you mean. Do you mean that good people that are religious can do good things? I see that, no problem. In fact, I've worked with people that are believers. I have friends that are believers. Even though I'm a very hard firebrand atheist, I'm always kind to people because I believe that people own themselves. But I do require them to think, or at least, wish them to think. How's that? To me, that if they really thought, hell claims debunk gods. It just does. If you offer your God as reasonable and then say you created hell, it's over. It's not reasonable no more.
Yeah. No, you bring up a good point. There are a lot of, particularly the community aspects of religion. A lot of people who continue to go to church year after year do so because it's kind of social inertia. And they like being part of a community, and that's a good and healthy thing. It's actually a challenge for the secular movement to try to develop those support structures that will keep people or attract people to a more secular outlook.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting though you're saying that though, because see, this is the thing people that they forget. Like they think like somehow religion has good and bad or whatever. No, there's some religions, parts of it or whatever, that are just toxic in a sense. So when they say good people, well, good people are generally in good, let's say good churches. I'm just talking off the top of my head. So good churches. I mean, let's say the Westboro Baptist Church is not a good church by definition. I mean, almost anybody that goes and supports that church is supporting something actively not good. So to say that you go there and then try to go the argument that Christians do good, well, maybe some Christians do good, but that church does not. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, and a lot of people will be very sort of selective in reading the Bible, and most Christians, most people aren't necessarily interested in having theological or philosophical discussions, and most Christians will just read the Bible devotionally, so they won't think critically about it. They'll just sort of go along with the sermon of the day, and then go back home and watch the football game. I mean, that's kind of the extent of their Sunday religion.
Yeah, and what's funny too is that people I wanted to relate to that we've mentioned heaven and hell, and I wanted to mention that a lot of people don't know that there's a portion in the Bible that talks about scary beasts in heaven. So I'll read it. It says, "And before the throne of God there was a sea of glass like crystal, and around the throne there were 4 beasts." Full of eyes in front and behind. The first beast was a lion, the second beast a calf, the third beast had a face of a man, the fourth beast was like a flying eagle. And then to me, that's a lot of totemistic stuff, really. If you put, it comes from, totemism is 50,000 years old. And this is just a continuation of that kind of thinking. Anyways, and the 4 beasts, each had 6 wings about them, and they were full of eyes within. Like, what, inside the wings? Like, some of the Christian stuff, you're like, what drugs were you on? Come on. This is not something you write or what kind of a, schizophrenic delusions were you on? You're like, dude, if someone came up and said to you, hey, I saw this, you'd be like, okay, what? Anyway, eyes on wings. There's not an animal that I know of that has that. I mean, that wouldn't even be functional or it's weird. But anyways, it says, so and the rest, and they rest not day and night. And that's Revelations 4:6-8.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course Revelation was the last book written, and the last book to be added to the canon. There was a lot of debate because a lot of the early church fathers thought they had the same reaction. They said, this is crazy shit. And but particularly Bishop Athanasius, who was a real intellectual force in the 5th century, he kind of noted that, actually Revelation has some messages that can be useful politically. And this idea of a coming apocalypse can certainly sharpen people's minds. So despite great controversy, the book of Revelation was added to the New Testament. And it was written by, this guy John of Patmos that nobody knows anything else about, other than he had this experience. And it's extraordinary that some people could read that and say, yeah, let's include that in the most important book we can think of. Let's include that.
I agree. What I think is interesting too is I don't know if you know, but I also looked into near-death experiences because I wanted to I wanted to debunk the soul and also the heaven-hell issue, because the supposed near-death experiences of people are, well, that's how they know heaven is real or whatever. But shouldn't they also know that hell is real? I mean, are you saying that everyone goes to heaven? Because I've heard,
it's interesting.
Right? So
all the people who come back from near-death experiences were on their way to heaven.
Right. Everybody? Seriously? So, but actually, so I looked into it, and it's not everybody, really. There's actually a percentage. I think it was like 10%, or maybe it was 10%. I think it's 10%. I think it's 10% of near-death experiences. I have somewhere, I have a blog on this called Death, No Ghosts, Spirit, Souls, something like that. Anyways, but they near-death experiences for the people that and what they call it is negative near-death experiences and positive near-death experiences. And the negative near-death experiences also come in three general varieties. I did this whole research on it. So the three different varieties, and one is like, just it's unpleasant, not really hell, but kind of unpleasant, that they think they're in it. They're uncomfortable. Then another one is, but that's most of the people that have negative ones. It's kind of like,
right.
like not too bad. Then the ones that are the most extreme, let's just go down to the third one. So the ones that's most extreme, like that people would call actual hell, where the people think that they're burning or being tortured or chased by demons or something. So that I think it's 60%. Yeah, 60%. If I'm remembering right. So I'm better at, like, just so people know, or you know too, Bill. I'm way better at big picture thinking than super detailed. I think I'm like a polymath. I think like all over the place, all kinds of ideas, like super far. I have a lot harder time focusing. But so anyway, so I think it's like I said, 60. But the thing is that those are people. 60% tried to commit suicide, or something like that. So when that happened. So they were saying that in the article, even it said that that someone had kind of figured out, because it was a thing I looked at, but it said that it was something like that it seems that the more you're, in a sense, psychologically stressed or depressed, the more chance that when you have that experience, which you feel is a near-death experience or whatever, that it's going to be negative. The more that, in a sense, you don't, then you have just heaven. Like, so the majority of the people have positive. Almost nobody has negative, which that alone, Christians, if you think near-death experience proved anything, even if you just believe the stats, okay, then everyone goes to heaven.
Yeah, what'd you say, only 10%? So
only 10%, and they said that it made
7 billion people on the planet, only 700 million are going to go to hell.
Yeah. Well, and not only that, the people at the site, they said, there's about near-death experience, I think research or something, but they said that the interesting thing is there's no difference per religion, including atheism. No difference. Almost all atheists, in a sense, go to heaven or whatever. I'm saying if they have a near-death experience, what they feel like a near-death experience.
Right.
So what I'm saying is that they said that shows that all religions, in a sense, need to understand that, because that would mean that, in a sense, almost nobody really goes to hell. Even if you believe that stuff, and even if you believed in religion, you still, if you actually believe in the stats and you think that means the proof, well, then the proof is that your religion isn't totally right. All of the religions.
Yeah, that's it. That's very interesting. Yeah, so if they fall into the trap of believing in near-death experiences,
right,
and it just shows that their other beliefs are wrong.
Right, so either you have to say you don't fully believe the stats on near-death religion, your near-death experiences, but then isn't that your proof? How do you use the proof and yet not believe it?
Yeah.
So,
well, it reminds me of people who say, well, I can prove there's a soul because when people die, they lose 1/32 of an ounce of their weight. I'm sure you've heard that, which always makes me laugh.
Nonsense.
Because even, souls are supposed to be immaterial, so there's not supposed to be a weight impact or when you die anyway. So it's kind of, you get these hilarious arguments.
Well, that's pseudoscience. That was like the 1800s. One wacky dude tried like a 5 bodies, I think it was. They wasn't even all accurate. He just gave it an average because I think one was way more, one was a little bit less, and yeah, the whole thing is just not science, people. Period.
Yeah. So we're left with, as we cope with real world experiences on a day-to-day basis, we have these ancient ideas ricocheting around our culture and our politics. And so that gets back to doing the kind of thing you're doing and the kind of thing I'm doing, is just trying to reach out to people and point out these difficulties, because, we've got to share this planet. And so what other people believe winds up affecting us, because other beliefs influence actions. It influences votes, the whole thing. So, this is really kind of self-preservation on our part, is to help people think as clearly as possible about these issues. Now, I don't claim to have all the answers, but, I want to engage in a dialogue.
Well, I've enjoyed the dialogue that we've had.
Yeah, no, this has been outstanding. So I'm looking forward to seeing the finished product, and hopefully you have a link. Maybe I can send you the link to my website where I've got some clips from the book and so on.
Yeah, well, I'm going to attach a blog that I'm making. It'll have all your info. I mean, everything.
Super. Definitely. That's great. Appreciate that. I really enjoyed the chat.
Yeah, and before we go, could you go ahead again and give us the rundown of your book? Tell us the name. Tell us where we can get it. Tell us just real quick again, like what it's about and the stuff.
Sure. The name of the book is Seeing Through Christianity, A Critique of Evidence and Beliefs. My name is Bill Zuersher. But you can get the book on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. Just type in Seeing Through Christianity on Google. You'll probably stumble into me and or the book. And what I tried to do in the book, the first half of the book, is a breakdown of the major Christian doctrines. Each one, one at a time. And there's really only 3, 4, 5 pages per chapter. The chapters I cover the fall, original sin, Satan, atonement, revelation, faith, Trinity, Holy Spirit, morality, purpose. So those are just some of the chapter headings. And in the second part of the book, I talk about evidence. I talk about Paul, talk about oral tradition, the canon debates, difficulties with the gospel, the composition, the preservation, contradictions, and then I end up with always a fun discussion on the resurrection, and then legendary growth after that. So I think I tie it all together. I've had some Christians tell me that, although they disagreed with it, they actually enjoyed my description of the Christian doctrines, because I start each chapter trying to give a sort of a reasonably fair description of what the belief is before I critique it. And I've had some Christians say, hey, I really enjoyed the description of the Christian doctrines. I learned some things myself reading your book, so that was fun.
That's cool. Yeah, and so people know that your book is over 300 pages. So when because you said, I don't want people to get the impression that your book isn't a worthy tome of information. It's not like that was all I wanted to say, because you said, it's just a couple pages. Well, I agree. You've done a superb job of laying out the book. I just don't want people to think that the way you said it, that it's not a substantial book. This is a credible, substantial book.
Yeah, it should have everything you need in it, but it should have it in sort of bite-sized chunks, which is a way I like to think and communicate.
Yeah, definitely. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you giving me this time.
All right. Well, thank you. All the best to you, Dan. Look forward to staying in touch.
Definitely. All right. Bye.
Okay, bye-bye.